Okay, so we left off on the energy sources for how we generate the ATP for muscle contractions. So ATP stands for adenine triphosphate, right? So this is the energy currency of the body. This is what we need to generate to have the energy to cause muscles to contract. And we're going to go through certain steps here, or certain different phases depending on where we are in this cycle of producing the energy. First up, when you're sitting there doing nothing and you're in your desk, you're using aerobic respiration. Okay? So that's what we're going to use first is aerobic respiration. We're going to shift into what's called the phosphagen system, and then anaerobic fermentation, sometimes called glycogen lactic acid system. We're going to move then into aerobic respiration, and then we could eventually move back into anaerobic fermentation if we push ourselves too far. So immediate energy needs. So I just want to make sure everybody understands, when you're sitting there at rest, taking your notes, looking at the PowerPoint, you're using aerobic respiration. You really haven't started this process yet. The amount of oxygen you're taking in with your what's called tidal volume breathing is enough to generate the ATP you need to do what you're doing. But should all of a sudden you have a burst of activity, okay, enough to power a 6-second sprint or a 1-minute brisk walk, your body's going to start moving faster, your muscles are going to start working harder, but at this point your cardiovascular system, your heart rate hasn't had a chance to get up elevated just yet, and your breathing hasn't gotten elevated enough to get the extra oxygen you need. So you're going to get some of this oxygen you need bound to myoglobin in the muscle. Myo means muscle. Globin we've probably heard of in the form of hemoglobin, and hemoglobin's on the red blood cells, and its job is to bind oxygen. So here we're binding oxygen in the muscles for just this purpose, to use this oxygen to create ATP. Okay? Now, the other thing we're going to do is we're going to use a couple enzymes, and we're going to use what's called the phosphagen system. And what we do there is we take ADP, the end product of hydrolyzing ATP. So when we hydrolyze ATP, we cleave off a phosphate. Adenine triphosphate means how many phosphates are there? 3. You cleave one off, how many are left? 2. Adenine diphosphate. That's what we see in this picture here. So what happens is we kind of recycle the aftermath of the hydrolyzation of ATP, and what's left is adenine diphosphate. So we take 2 of those, we use this myokinase enzyme, and instead of coming to the party with 2 and 2, we run it to the party and we leave with 3 and 1. 1 adenine triphosphate, shown here, okay, shown here. So ADP coming in the process of myokinase, and we get the ATP, and then the adenine monophosphate, 3 and 1. Okay? So it's basically the phosphagen system is transferring phosphates from one molecule to another, transferring it to another ADP. The other enzyme we can use is called creatine kinase. With this enzyme, we take an ADP, we take creatine phosphate, we come to the party with those. Creatine phosphate then takes the phosphate off of creatine and adds it to the ADP to give us ATP. Once again, that's the energy currency that we need. So, 2 enzymes in the phosphagen system, myokinase, creatine kinase. Myokinase takes a phosphate group from one ADP and adds it to another ADP. Okay? Second enzyme, creatine kinase. This enzyme takes a phosphate from creatine phosphate and binds it to an ADP to once again make ATP. And this fulfills your immediate energy needs, that first 6 seconds, because your cardiovascular system, your breathing, respiratory system aren't working optimally just yet to supply the oxygen you need for the ATP. So this fills in the gaps until this catches up. So like I said at the beginning, power is a 1 minute brisk walk or a 6-second sprint. Okay, so that's immediate energy needs. Then we go to your short-term energy needs. Eventually this system's going to be exhausted, okay? And we're going to have to find another way to fill in the gaps because we still, at that 6-second mark, heart rate, breathing, still aren't up to where they need to be just yet, but they're coming. So we shift into what's called anaerobic fermentation, okay? In this situation, the muscles obtain glucose from the blood, okay? So we've got glucose in our blood, and the glucose that we had extra from other meals, from our lifestyle, how much we eat, the extra gets stored as the stored form of glucose, which we call glycogen. So first we use the glucose in the blood. The liver had packaged up extra glucose in the form of glycogen, and we start breaking that down, freeing it up, turning it into glucose, and producing ATP. Now, anaerobic means what? Without oxygen. So we're doing this without oxygen. So when we do this anaerobic fermentation, we take a glucose and we turn it into ATP, but without oxygen, we only yield 2 ATP for every 1 glucose, which isn't very efficient, okay? If, in turn, we did have oxygen present and we did this glycolysis, we would now get 36 ATP per 1 glucose. So you see, with oxygen's 9 times more efficient than without. Okay? The other problem with anaerobic fermentation is a toxic byproduct known as lactic acid. Lactic acid's an acid. It's going to do what to the pH? It's going to lower the pH. As we lower the pH, that's going to make some of the enzymes not work as efficiently as they could. Okay? Not to mention lactic acid, you've probably heard of. This is what settles in the muscles and makes you feel sore the next day. Okay? So this is the system that we're going to use in our short-term energy needs. So this is the next 20 to 30 seconds of activity. So we did 6-second sprint. Now we've got 20 more, 30 more seconds, so we're 26, 36 seconds, and these are just ballpark numbers. Everybody's different. We're still waiting for our cardiovascular system to catch up. But these two, the immediate and short-term energy needs, the phosphagen system, and then the anaerobic fermentation, are filling in the gaps until finally our cardiovascular system and our breathing catch up. Okay? That would then take us to our long-term energy needs. This is somewhere after that 40-second mark. Our breathing and heart rate have caught up, and now we're delivering the oxygen that we need. Now we're turning that glucose into ATP at the rate of 1 glucose, 36 ATP. And this is going to be able to keep pace with the demand that our body's requiring to power our muscles. Okay? We're also not using that anaerobic fermentation pathway, so we're not going to produce very much lactic acid, which is good. So now we're not inhibiting the enzymes and everything's going to work properly. This is what a lot of athletes or people that just run refer to as catching your second wind. You start off, use these other pathways, and it doesn't work quite as well. But as soon as your breathing and heart rate catch up, now it feels like you can go for a much, much longer time, more optimally. Okay? So here's our first question up here. Sitting at your desk right now, you're getting the ATP your brain and body needs via what? Yeah, that would be the aerobic respiration. Okay? The next system we move into would be the phosphagen system, then to anaerobic respiration, then back to aerobic respiration. So what is fatigue? Fatigue is basically your muscles getting tired and weaker. They're not contracting optimally. Okay? Generally from prolonged use, you're using them over and over and over again. And a lot of that is this shortage in your body able to produce the ATP necessary. Okay? So part of that, with the not being able to make the ATP, there's two factors. One is, do you have enough oxygen? And two, do you have enough nutrients, glucose, glycogen, fatty acids, to make glucose to make the ATP? So this fatigue will start to take place as you've used up the glucose and then also the glycogen in your system. After your body gets done with glycogen, it'll move on to breaking down fats for energy. And this is why we store fats, is for energy. It's not the best source of energy, but it works. You break them down, your body takes the fatty acids and tries to build glucose back out of those, and then we use it just like we would glucose. If we run short on ATP, we can no longer maintain the sodium-potassium pumps. Okay? The sodium-potassium pumps, we've talked about, pump 3 sodium out for every 2 potassium they pump in. And this helps set up that unequal distribution of electrolytes at the membrane so that when we open up the channels, these things can move down their concentration gradient and depolarize the cell. Okay? If we don't have as much sodium pumped out, then the inside isn't as negative and the sodium doesn't want to come in as badly as it would normally want. Okay? Lactic acid buildup lowers the pH of the sarcoplasm. This can inhibit enzyme function. I think I mentioned that a second ago. We get an increase of extracellular potassium. The potassium is not being pumped in like it should. Once again, that causes us a problem. It lowers our membrane potential and excitability, makes muscles less likely to fire. And we can even use up our neurotransmitter acetylcholine at those motor end plates. So that takes us to being able to maintain a moderate to high level of exercise and not fatigue out. That's our endurance. Okay, so the ability to maintain high intensity exercise. And one of the main factors for this, we know we're trying to make ATP, so we know we need nutrients and we need what? Oxygen. So our endurance is tied directly to our maximum oxygen uptake. How much oxygen can I take in with each breath? How much oxygen can I take in a minute? The more I can take in, the more ATP I can make, the more energy I'll have. Okay? So part of this, bigger lungs take in more air, take in more oxygen. So this is directly proportional to body size. Bigger people can take in more oxygen. They have a higher oxygen uptake, but they have longer levers, usually more mass. They have to work harder to do the same thing that somebody smaller would have to do. So it balances itself out a little bit. Your maximum oxygen uptake peaks at about age 20. After that, you're over the hill and everything's on the downside. Okay? When you train, part of what you're training is to get your body better at getting in the oxygen that it needs. So in somebody that trains, their maximum oxygen uptake can be twice that of somebody who doesn't exercise or do endurance type activities. Okay? Also, since males are bigger, they tend to have a larger maximum oxygen uptake versus females. Okay, so your maximum oxygen uptake would be larger in trained athletes and males. That makes sense. The other factor we said was oxygen and glucose. So endurance is determined by our nutrient availability. How much glucose is available? How much glycogen is stored? How many fatty acids, how much fat's available to break down after all those are gone? Because once you get done with fats, you'll even turn on proteins, which that's what your muscles are made out of. So you don't want to start breaking down proteins for energy. That's going to actually break down the muscles, and the muscles are going to get weaker. Okay? So one strategy that people use to try to increase endurance prior to an event is what's called carbohydrate loading. Okay, so it's basically adding extra carbohydrates to your diet the night before a big event, so that extra carbohydrates in your diet, your liver packages into glycogen and you have extra stored energy. Now, any of you that have ever tried this, if you do too much of that, this extra glucose, glycogen Storing some of this in your muscles tends to draw water with it, and you can kind of feel sluggish. So there's a point of where you overdo it, and you don't feel quite as like you're performing quite as well either. Oxygen debt. So just like when you started off with the exercise and your body's working really hard, but your muscles and body are working really hard, but your breathing hasn't caught up. Once you say you cross the finish line and you stop running, do you immediately stop breathing heavy? Does your heart rate immediately go back to normal? No. Okay? And this is your body's doing this intentionally because what it wants to do is replace the oxygen it's used up, replace the stored oxygen. And what they call this is your excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. How much oxygen do you need to take in now after the fact to replenish all those areas? In case for some reason you got to get up and do it all again. Okay? So what do we use that extra oxygen for? We use it for replacing our oxygen reserves. Those reserves are in the myoglobin, storing the extra oxygen in the muscles. We dissolve some oxygen, we have some oxygen bound to hemoglobin in the blood. Let's replace that. There's oxygen dissolved in the blood plasma. Let's replace that. Okay? And if we can do that, then our body will be able to, once again, if called upon, have some energy to power through and do some sort of exercise for a little bit longer time than it would have otherwise. The oxygen also we also want to replenish the phosphagen system, and we want to return the ATP, creatine phosphate, all those things to their resting level, and it helps also the extra breathing, movement, circulating the blood that has the lactic acid in it, taking it to the kidneys and the liver, and they'll break it down and they'll reconvert it back into glucose. So we're recycling that, taking that lactic acid, we're going to turn it back into glucose. So now we've got our energy source again, plus if we break down the lactic acid, then it can't pool around the muscles and we won't feel this source. So that's usually why when they cross a finish line or you get done with some sort of conditioning, they want you to keep moving, keep breathing. The deep breaths, the movement, the circulation, the oxygen can help break that lactic acid down to your benefit. Now, not all muscle fibers are alike. Okay? All muscle fibers of a motor unit are, but not all of them are alike. And these breakdown is determined genetically. Okay? So you're going to have what are called slow twitch and fast twitch fibers. And the breakdown that you have in your body is determined genetically by what's passed on from your parents. Okay? I forget exactly what it is, but I want to ballpark it, say about 50% of these fibers can change back and forth depending on the type of exercise you do. Okay? So you can train to turn some of these more into the slow twitch fibers or train them into the fast twitch fibers, but you are capped genetically by what was given to you by your parents. So fibers of a single motor unit are similar. We knew that. We have what are called slow twitch or slow oxidative fibers. These are your endurance fibers. They are better adapted to help with endurance. So they have more mitochondria. Those are the powerhouses of the cell. That's what's actually generating the ATP. They have more capillaries, meaning they get a better blood supply. They're just better adapted for aerobic respiration because that's what's going to give us the most endurance. The longer we're in aerobic respiration, we're doing activity, the longer we can do that activity. So these types of fibers resist fatigue very well. Second type are called fast glycolytic or fast twitch fibers. These fibers are more for strength, power, short-term explosion. These fibers, their sarcoplasmic reticulum release calcium quickly and in large amounts. And the more calcium you release, the stronger the contraction. So it leads to faster contractions, powerful contractions. And they tend to be rich in the enzymes for the phosphagen system and for anaerobic fermentation. Okay? They're going to produce lactic acid, so they're susceptible to fatigue. But prior to that fatigue, they're going to contract very strongly. Okay? So depending on how you're training, this is what you're setting up with your body. Okay? And you can see a little bit of this based on, say, runners. If you're a sprinter, you look at most of those sprinters in the Olympics that run the 100-yard dash, they look like they could be football running backs. You look at the distance runner in the Olympics, and they have almost no mass on their upper body because they don't want to carry the extra weight. They don't want to feed that extra muscle mass in their body blood because then that's stealing it from their legs. So when you train, you're trying to train in a certain way to get the results you want. Okay? If you want better endurance, then you want to train for endurance. Now, when we do train, the muscles can get bigger. Okay? So if we're trying to increase the strength of the muscle, okay, and we train as such, the muscles are going to get bigger. The bigger the muscle, the stronger the muscle. Okay? Not only that, but your body actually works on the number and size of motor units that it's able to recruit. So when you initially start exercising and you see some strength gains, you're actually able to lift more, but your body hasn't really changed. That's because your nervous system is recruiting more motor units and larger ones to do the job. Okay, so you're kind of honing those neural pathways initially. So the frequency of stimulation, the higher the frequency, the increase in strength, and also skeletal muscle has an optimum length. So if the muscle's too stretched out, it can't contract maximally, and if it's too tight, it can't contract maximally. So you want to stretch it out a little bit because anytime you exercise tends to tighten the muscles. So you stretch them out a little bit, get them to that optimum length, and then they'll respond for you. So the way to make the muscles bigger would be some sort of resistance training, weightlifting. Stimulates cell enlargement by what we call hypertrophy. Okay, cells get bigger because we don't actually get more muscle fibers. The muscle fibers we have get bigger. We do get more myofibrils, and we do get more myofilaments that make up the muscle fiber. That's true, but the muscle fiber number themselves stay the same. And so we synthesize more of the myofilaments, more of the myofibrils. Endurance training, you're trying to do aerobic exercise. You're not trying to make the muscles bigger per se. You're trying to increase the number of mitochondria in the muscle. You're trying to increase the amount of glycogen that the muscles have access to, increase the blood supply to the muscle. All those things will help with endurance. Okay? So weight training, you're stimulating a little more of the fast twitch fibers. Endurance training, you're stimulating more of the slow twitch fibers. Okay? Then we move into cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle doesn't have long fibers. They're shorter branch cells, so we're not going to call them muscle fibers. We're going to call them myocytes, myocells, muscle cells. And one unique characteristic of a cardiac muscle is it has what are called intercalated discs. These are a combination of an electrical gap junction. So you have to remember what the gap junction was. It allowed direct communication. So one cell runs, butts up against another cell, and has a gap junction. This allows the cell that was, if you had them in a sequence, one cell here, synapses on a cell here. If we stimulate this cell, that impulse that was conducted down the sarcolemma will cross through the gap junction to the next adjacent muscle. Okay? Because cardiac muscle, we're not wanting them to contract really strong, but we want them all to contract together in a unit to do their job. Okay? So the gap junctions allow one cell to pass on or stimulate the one next to it. It's also kind of a desmosome, a mechanical junction, so it helps hold the muscles together so that when they contract, they don't pull apart from each other. Now, cardiac muscle, like I just said, isn't going to be necessary for it to contract really strong, like maybe your pectoralis major or your gluteus maximus. So the strength of contraction came from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, right? And skeletal muscle. So would you expect cardiac muscle to have as well developed a sarcoplasmic reticulum as skeletal muscle, or not as well? Right. It's going to have a less developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. It actually, the cardiac muscle, the T-tubules let in some calcium from the extracellular fluid to help with contraction. Cardiac muscle cells, when they're damaged, they're repaired by fibrosis, not mitosis. So that means that what? Function is not restored. So it's filled in with scar tissue. So that means that what died there isn't going to longer be able to contract, and it's not going to be able to conduct, okay? Which is going to be a problem, okay? Cardiac muscle cells also said to be autorhythmic, meaning it generates its own action potentials. So skeletal muscle needed the nervous system to tell it to contract. If the nervous system didn't innervate the muscle, there was a problem there. We said that muscle was paralyzed. Cardiac muscle is autorhythmic. It has what are called pacemaker cells. SA node of the heart generates its own action potentials. So you could cut off a chicken's head or open up a chicken and the heart could still be beating while it's dead. That's how we have somebody being declared brain dead. The brain is no longer functioning, but the heart's still beating because the heart's generating its own action potentials, but the person's gone. Okay. Cardiac skeletal muscles had how many nuclei? One or more than one? More than one. Why? Because they were long. Cardiac muscle cells, we said, weren't long. So do we expect them to have multiple nuclei or no? Right. They're going to be uninucleated. Cardiac muscle cells are striated, meaning we have the A bands and the I bands, meaning we have the thin and thick filaments, meaning we have the sarcomere, the Z disc. So if we have all the same structures, then guess what? It contracts the same way as skeletal muscle. Okay? Cardiac muscle, we said we don't want it to be able to contract super strong, but we definitely want it to have great endurance. So cardiac muscle cells are very well adapted for aerobic respiration. 70 times a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours in a day. It's beating 100,000 times a day. So we want it to do this without getting tired. So it's well adapted for aerobic respiration. The downside is it doesn't have anaerobic fermentation. It doesn't have the phosphagen system at its disposal. So if we interrupt the oxygen to the cardiac muscle has no plan B and will end up in those tissues dying. Okay? Because it's well adapted for aerobic respiration, it's going to have large mitochondria. These are going to help make it resistant to fatigue, but like I said, it's going to be vulnerable to interruptions in oxygen. Looking at smooth muscle, it's the muscle nobody cares about. It's said to have what are called fusiform cells, which mean they're kind of cigar-shaped. They taper at the ends, they're a little fatter in the middle. Once again, they're not long cells, so they're going to be uninucleated. Smooth muscle is not striated, no striations, which means there's no sarcomeres, there's no Z discs. It does have thin and thick filaments and has what's called dense bodies, and they're kind of interdispersed through the sarcoplasm, but because they don't have the same setup, they do not contract the same way that skeletal and cardiac muscles contract. Now, we're not going to worry about how they contract because, like I said, they're smooth muscle and nobody gives a darn about them. Okay? Smooth muscle makes up the muscle of, say, your GI tract for peristalsis. Are we going to need super strong contractions? No, we're not. Okay? So it has very little sarcoplasmic reticulum, no T-tubules to speak of. A lot of the calcium it gets for contraction comes from the extracellular fluid. Smooth muscle, I should go back. Cardiac muscle, is that voluntary or involuntary? Do you have control of cardiac muscle? Conscious control? No, so it's involuntary. Skeletal muscle? Voluntary. Smooth muscle is involuntary once again. Peristalsis happens, vasomotor, blood vessel dilation, vasomotor tone, blood vessel dilation, and constriction happens without your conscious thought on that. Okay? So the nerve supply then that modifies it is the autonomic nervous system. That's the same nervous system that modifies cardiac muscle. They generate their own action potentials, but they do get modified by the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system specifically. So neurotransmitter that is used from the autonomic nervous system is either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. Different effects in different locations. Okay? Can be autorhythmic, generate its own action potentials, And it is capable of hyperplasia, making more smooth muscle cells, and mitosis. When the smooth muscle is damaged, they'll regenerate more cells to replace it so function is not lost. Okay? There's two types of smooth muscle. We have what's called multi-unit smooth muscle. This is found generally in the largest arteries. It's found in the smooth muscle around the iris, in the erector pili muscle, in the skin. And this has the same setup as skeletal muscle, where we have neurons with their terminal end plates synapsing on individual smooth muscle cells, myocytes. Okay? So in this picture here, this is what it's showing. This comes down on this myocyte, this synapse on this myocyte, this myocyte. So when an action potential comes down, only the one synapsed upon will contract. Okay? That's what we saw with skeletal muscle. Okay? That's why they call it multi-unit. Each smooth muscle cell can act independently of the others. Okay? So in this thing here, maybe these three contract because they're innervated by a motor neuron, and these are innervated by a different one, so they don't. They act independently. Multi-unit smooth muscle. So that gives us independent contraction. When we look at the other type, we have what's called single-unit smooth muscle, meaning they act as one unit. Okay, we find these in the blood vessels and in the smooth muscle of the GI tract. In the GI tract, we generally have two layers. We have an inner circular and an outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle. These types of smooth muscle are connected by gap junctions so that when one's stimulated, they're all stimulated. Okay? And this allows the bundle, the group, to contract together as one. When one of them gets the impulse, they all get the impulse. And then it's actually set up a little differently too. We don't have the motor end plates. We have these what are called varicosities. The autonomic nervous system that modifies this contraction is over the top of it, and we have these little bead-like swellings called varicosities where we hold the neurotransmitter. And when the impulse comes down, these open up almost like sprinkler systems and rain down the neurotransmitter. Okay? So it's raining down on all of them at the same time, plus they're electrically coupled with the gap junction so that all of them contract together. There's no independence. So that's why they call it single unit. So bead-like swellings and varicosities contain synaptic vesicles. We've got no motor end plates, and we stimulate lots of these myocytes all at once. All right. Contraction and relaxation of smooth muscle. Is it going to contract fast or slow, would you guess? Slow contraction. We don't need it to be fast. Generally 25 to 50 times slower than skeletal muscle. Okay? And that's because we have a slow myosin ATPase enzyme in smooth muscle, so we slowly hydrolyze the myosin head. And then we have slow pumps to remove the calcium, meaning the relaxation process is going to be slow. But there's a trade-off. The benefit is smooth muscle uses anywhere from 10 to 300 times less energy, less ATP, to maintain the same amount of tension that it would take skeletal muscle. Okay? So that means it can hold that partial state of contraction using far less energy than what our skeletal muscle would use. Okay? And the reason for this is the myosin does not immediately release the actin after it does the power stroke. Okay? And it has what's called a latch bridge mechanism that kind of helps lock it in place and hold it there. So it contracts and it holds, and it doesn't use a lot of ATP to do it. And this allows us to keep our arteries in a partial state of contraction called vasomotor tone. If we didn't have this partial state of contraction, and the blood vessels all dilated at once, the blood pressure would go down so fast and so far that we wouldn't have enough pressure to get it to our brain, and we would pass out and then stroke out. Okay? So smooth muscle, here's a little bit. We've got thin and thick filaments. These dense bodies are in some haphazard arrangement, and when they do contract and they do pull on each other, this thing kind of folds up and twists on itself. Here's another picture showing that. Lastly, how skeletal muscle responds to stretch. First of all, stretch is a mechanical stimulus. It can cause smooth muscle to contract. So when you stretch a smooth muscle, it opens up because the stretch is the mechanic stimuli for calcium channels. The calcium comes in, and that leads to muscle contraction, causes our muscle to respond by contraction. Think of this in our GI tract. When we swallow food, it stretches the esophagus, or it stretches the stomach, or it stretches the small intestine. When it stretches it, that stimulates the peristalsis to take place and move that food along, whereby it moves somewhere else, stretches it, and it continues along. Smooth muscle also has a stress relaxation response, which kind of overrides this contraction, necessary for things like the urinary bladder. So fluid starts to fill in the bladder, it stretches the bladder would normally respond by contracting, and we would feel the urge to urinate. This gets overridden and the bladder kind of relaxes. So when it's stretched, tissue briefly contracts, then relaxes. And the last thing about smooth muscle, it has a characteristic known as plasticity, where skeletal muscle had an optimum length. If it was too stretched out or too tight, it wouldn't contract optimally. That's not the case for smooth muscle. Plasticity is the ability to adjust the degree of stretch. So if it's shortened or if it's stretched out, smooth muscle will still be able to contract optimally. Not super hard, but optimally enough that it needed to do its job and hold that contraction. And this plasticity prevents organs from becoming too stretched out and not being able to do their job then. So we stretch them out, they can still do their job. They can still get the job done, like the stomach or even the bladder. And that's it for this unit. Thank you.